Well, good afternoon, everyone. I know we have people here in Rush Auditorium. We have Dr. George and our guest speaker who will be introduced shortly, Josh Wood, on the screen. And I think we also have people watching via webinar. This is our hybrid version of the college's Research Expo. For those of you who don't know, I'm Eileen DeLuca. I'm the provost here at Florida Southwestern, and I'm so excited about this event every year. Giving faculty and students the opportunity to do research and scholarship is something that is uniquely part of the strategic directions of this college, and also just to support creativity in general. So thanks to Dr. Van Galen, the authors of sponsored programs, all of Team Aspire. I see a lot of Team Aspire out there. Raise your hands for bringing this event to us every year. If we could give them a hand, whether you want to clap on your webinar. Also this year, the student research is sponsored by the Honor Scholar Program. Thanks to Dr. Chase for all her work in really promoting scholarship among students and connecting students with our world-class faculty so that they can see the type of research or just the disciplinary interests of some of our faculty and help students connect there and engage in that mentoring so that they really get excited about doing scholarship. I also want to say thank you to all of the faculty that supported the students as they worked on these capstone projects, Dr. Chase, Dr. Jacqueline Davis. We had Professor Dana Rose, Professor Stephen Chase, Dr. Mark Herman, Professor Ihasha Horn, and Dr. Brandy George, who you see on the screen right now. So if we can give a hand to the faculty who really inspired these students and supported their scholarship. So again, I'm really excited about this event today, but what I'm most excited about is what I just saw outside. Whether you walked up and heard the students talk about the research they've done or whether you saw it via Zoom, your minds, if they're like mine, must be blown. Our students are doing amazing work. They had amazing ideas. They engaged in scholarship that I don't know that I could still do at this point in my career, but from across the discipline. So hopefully you are excited about this and excited that these are the type of opportunities we offer here at FSW for students. So thanks to all of those students for really inspiring me outside. There's many more presentations to come. The author that we've invited is going to be introduced. We also have, of course, Dr. Brandon Jett, one of our local superstars, who'll be talking about his amazing research, and then more student presentations, both posters and live presentations. So hopefully as much as you can, you'll engage. And once again, a big hand to the guy over here sweating, running around, doing everything from making sure that the students are supported to carrying tables in. Let's give a hand to Dr. Van Galen.
This is usually the fun part where I get to introduce our speaker. But I have to say, our speaker today is so awesome, so amazing. I'm not good enough to give the introduction. So we actually have our secondary intro person right here, Dr. Brandy George here, who's going to help us introduce our wonderful guest speaker today. So Brandy, why don't you go ahead and take it off?
Okay, thank you guys so much. I'm so honored to get to introduce Josh Woods. He's such a wonderful writer, and before I do that, I want to just thank all of you for being here. Thank you for the students and Dr. DeLuca and Dr. Van Galen for making this all possible and for supporting this event. I also wanted to thank the FSW Foundation for funding the reading today. And also Dr. Teed and Wendy Thompson. You know, we all know Wendy Thompson runs the world. So thank you for supporting the event, Wendy. And again, I want to thank Dr. Joe Van Galen because his friendship with Professor Woods is what really sparked the event. And Van Galen is an avid fiction reader and discovered Professor Woods' work and made this connection with him and made this all possible for me to connect with him as well. So I'm really grateful for that. And so thank you so much, Dr. Van Galen, for making this connection. So let me just tell you a little bit about Professor Woods and his work. He's really one of the most talented up and coming fiction writers in the country. We're very lucky to have him today. He's well known for both his horror and action adventure work. His he has a novel, The Black Palace, and this wonderful award-winning short story collection. It says O Monstrous World. I don't know if it's backwards for you guys, but you can see it's a really beautiful collection that was amazing to read. And so if you end up really liking this reading, you should go check out his novel, The Black Palace, and this short story collection, O Monstrous World. So Professor Woods is known both for his fiction and for his acclaimed podcast, The Monster Professor, which I'll talk more about later. But he's a professor of English, editor of multiple anthologies and literary journals, and he often serves as a consultant for novel and short story manuscripts. His debut book of stories, O Monstrous World, won the International Book Awards for Fiction Short Story. This highly competitive award helps to promote the work of both famous and beginning writers around the world. Furthermore, his novel, The Black Palace, is an epic of Gothic horror action adventure. Also highly recommend that. He's known as an innovative, cerebral, highly adventurous writer. He's garnered high praise from well-known fiction writers as well. His other awards include Outstanding Full-Time Faculty Member of the Year, Press 53 Open Awards for Genre Fiction. He's received multiple Pushcart Prize nominations, as well as nominations for the Best of the Net and the Penn Robert W. Bingham Prize for Debut Short Story Collection, among others. In addition to his reputation as a fiction writer, Professor Woods is well known for his podcast, The Monster Professor, which explores the role of monsters in literature, myth, film, folklore, and pop culture. You may want to check out a few podcasts. We actually had the honor of working with Professor Woods to create 2 podcasts last fall. One is Dr. Joe Van Galen, who is our own oceanography professor, talked with Professor Woods in a podcast called Monstrous Nature, Ocean and Earth. It is absolutely terrifying and wonderful. So if you want to check it out, you can search it on Spotify, or you can check out Professor Woods' website, joshwoodsauthor.com, and check out the podcast there. I also had the opportunity to work with him on a podcast called Fairies and Demons with the chair of the English department, Dr. Amy Trogan. We talked about C.S. Lewis, we talked about exorcisms, we talked about all kinds of fascinating stuff, and you should feel free to check that out as well. That's called Fairies and Demons. So as I said, again, any links to the podcast, if you really love Woods' books or Woods reading, which I know you will, you may want to purchase one of his books, and you can go to joshwoodsauthor.com and find links to that. Additionally, I'd like to say that there will be a Q&A after the reading via chat. Since we'll be in a webinar, you won't be able to ask your questions out loud, but I do encourage you to please ask them via the chat, or if you're in the audience and you have a question, I'm sure you could relay that to Dr. Van Galen or someone so that they could ask that question for you. Please feel free to participate via chat as well. If you are watching and you're not in the audience and you want to just admire something about about the reading, or you have a question as you go, I would encourage you to just go ahead and pop that in the chat, and Josh will take a look at those after the reading's over and answer them as to the best of his ability. I think that is all of my spiel, but I'm just so honored, so excited about this reading. And I just want to thank you all for being here, and thank you so much to Professor Woods for being here. And so please welcome Professor Josh Woods.
Brandy, thank you so much for that fantastic intro. That was an awesome introduction. I feel a lot better about myself today after hearing all those awesome things. Oh, that was great. And hello, SFW. This is a huge honor to be a part of this expo. And I've got to thank everybody's been putting it together. Dr. DeLuca, Brandy, George, thank you so much. Joe Van Galen, Jessica Godwin, you've all been awesome and getting this together. So I really appreciate it. And And we had the idea that we were going to air this as a podcast on my podcast, The Monster Professor. So you are being recorded, and I double down on Brandy's invitation to participate as well. I really wish I could be there in person. I didn't get to run the world in the past year or so, or it would have been a lot different. So we'll just go with what we have here. But I really enjoy getting to participate with audience, hearing what's on your mind, what kinds of ideas you're curious about. So please feel free if you're not allowed to shout out stuff while I'm talking, then feel free to put them in the comments. I'll keep glancing over and taking a look at what you have going on. And yeah, that was a great introduction of some of the projects I'm into. I don't really even know what kind of thing I am anymore. Somebody asked recently, are you a podcaster? Are you an editor? Or what are you a writer? What are you? I don't know. I like projects, and I try to encourage students or other people, not even just students. I try to encourage everybody to really explore those things you like and find out ways that you can participate in them, even if that means making them yourself. And so those are a lot of the projects I'm involved in. I hear that there are creative writers among us in the audience as well. And so with that in mind, and knowing we have a lot of smart and cool readers as well, here's what I was thinking about doing for today. I was thinking about sharing some of my ideas that are, in one level, I consider them craft ideas, as in the craft of fiction, how to think about stories and how to build stories. But in another way, I think they kind of work in a literary analytical way. And so I was going to share some of those ideas with you, and then I was going to read a story of my own, and then I want to make sure we have plenty of time for question and answers, because, like I say, I like to do that. So if that sounds good to us, then how about I get into sharing some of these ideas? Ideas I've published a little bit, but I'm currently working on a fuller book about it, and they've really helped me as a writer. And I call it horror structure. So here's a beginning of, when we think of like the horror genre, or we think about genres in fiction, I think it's really easy to shuffle together content and structure of a story. And so you could have, for instance, a horror story that has all the trappings of horror. You have murderers or storms outside the castle, or an ancient family curse kind of thing. But you can also have the structure that doesn't have the content of the story, but still works in that same way, in the same way that you could have a screwdriver that you used to drive screws. So form and function are the same, but you could also use a screwdriver to do other things, right? And so that's not using it as a screwdriver. And so you can, but it's still the structure of a screwdriver. So one brilliant writer put story structure succinctly. Paulo Coelho, he's the writer of, most famously, The Alchemist. And at one point, and I think it's still the case, he holds the Guinness World Record for the single most translated book of a living author. So that's The Alchemist. It's been translated in more languages than any other book by a living author, which means he's got something figured out about what makes a story work universally. When he was asked about it, about how stories work, he said there are only two types of stories. He said there is the voyage of discovery, and that's one type, and a stranger comes to town. That's the second type. And to me, that seems like we have the quest story and the horror story. Now, the quest story has been analyzed for decades, and it's been analyzed brilliantly. Probably most famously, like Joseph Campbell, right? But it started Vladimir Prop. I would argue that we've seen it even in Freytag and in Aristotle. But the quest story is, I say, the extreme or polar opposite of, or maybe not opposite, I should say obverse, as in heads and tails of a coin. They're not opposite, they're obverse, being the other side of that thing. So the quest story does a whole slew of things structurally, and the horror story does almost the opposite or the obverse of all those things. And so the quest story, ever so briefly, and you're already familiar with it, even if you think you're not familiar with it, you are. You have a main character who starts out orphaned in some way. Like, all you have to do is click off all the orphans you can think of in your mind. Like, okay, Harry Potter and Luke Skywalker and Superman, Batman, and Spider-Man, and everybody who lives with their aunt, and Dorothy from Oz, and Katniss Everdeen. Well, not kind of Katniss. Moses. You just name, like, they start suddenly have a long list of people. Then they grow up, they're kind of guided by a wise mentor, they're given an object of power, whether it's their father's sword or magical slippers or a ring or something. And then they leave the home world, cross the threshold into the other world, where they encounter strange monsters or strange creatures and enemies, but also allies and strange friends. And they gain allies, they gain strength, they encounter troubles, but then they come out of it even stronger and more powerful and more self-assured. They have a deep moment of all is lost, and then they come out self-actualizing. The quest story, very, very briefly and crudely laid out. I think, no, there's been another story that's just as universal. I think it's just as ancient and it's just as important, and we don't talk about it on its own separately. And I think that's horror structure. And that's, instead of leaving town and going out on an adventure, you're in your home. And instead of going out into the other world where the strange creatures are, those strange creatures come into your house. That other thing crosses the threshold into your world. Rather than growing stronger, you get torn down. Rather than discovering your destiny and what you're meant for, you're faced with doom, with your dark fate. It was going to be like this all along. And so these things can work not only literally, like you can have the quest story with actual swords and dragons and ships and kings and queens and these things, but you can also do that figuratively. Think of Great Expectations, Charles Dickens, where you have a whole quest story. Pip, he's an orphan, he's given a strange magical gift when he's young. He's on this quest to be a gentleman. He has his ups and downs and faces various enemies and comes out of it self-actualized. Even though they never leave this like 50-mile radius in the UK, right? It's still a quest story without quest content. Well, you can have a horror story and horror content, but you can also have horror structure without it. I will go so far right now as to say we've got horror structure as probably the most popular structure of the literary short story. And so, brief rundown of literary short stories. And think quickly if you've ever been assigned to read them, or if you've ever actually read your assignment like you're supposed to, and you've ever read any of these. A&P, Cathedral, Enormous Radio, Greasy Lake, Lottery, Metamorphosis, Story of an Hour, Very Old Man with Enormous Wings, Where Are You Going, Where Have You Been, Yellow Wallpaper, Bartleby the Scrivener. I say these are all horror structure stories. And I think it works best for the literary short story. And I think horror structure comes down to 4 pillars. Not so much steps like quest. I think they're more like the 4 pillars that hold up the structure simultaneously and are the structure of the story. And those pillars are seclusion, the other, dissent, and doom. I've called them other things in the past. I like these terms better, so this is what I'm going with now. Um, and so a brief rundown of what those four things are. By seclusion, I mean, well, even the root of the word, seclusion, the Latin root means to separate and cut apart, but also to confine. And so in a horror structure story, you seclude your main characters by cutting them off from the rest of the world, from social engagement, from help from others, whether that's in a house like a Gothic house, or on an island, or in a town in which nobody really listens to them, or more figuratively, in a way that a character cuts off those from his or her life that they shouldn't have done so because of their own, say, immorality. Perhaps the main character in Raymond Carver's Cathedral. Raymond Carver's Cathedral is a way of seeing a character who kind of secluded himself through his, I don't know, his bad behavior as a bad person. So that's one, and that's the opposite of journeying out. The other is the second. In a horror structure story, somebody else or something that is unhuman or strange comes from the outside, crosses that threshold that normally keeps the normal world in its bubble, breaks that bubble, crosses that threshold, and comes into the house, comes into the ordinary world. And in literal horror stories in which content and structure coincide, very often you have either like a villain or a beast or a monster. My favorite, a monster. And but in a figurative story, it doesn't have to be supernatural at all. It can be something that the main character considers to be other or unhuman. And I think that the three essential ways to make a character unhuman or seeming unhuman to the protagonist, because the protagonist could be a bigoted kind of person or see things too narrowly, and so to see otherness where the reader wouldn't. But the three ways to do that figuratively are to take away sight and or speech and or soul, and in a way that our main character would see. In Cathedral, you have the blind man coming in, which scares the hell out of our main character, right? The blind man is coming to the home, and he has surrounded with this cloud of death. His wife just died, and he knows secrets about this main character because he's been corresponding with his wife in meaningful ways as kind of pen pals, audio pen pals. And so, and he can only imagine like blind people shambling around like the soulless dead, never laughing, I think he says. So to that main character, this is an unhuman thing coming into his world, but he can't go anywhere else because he doesn't have any other friends because he ran them all off. He doesn't really have a job to go to. And so he's stuck in the house, and here comes the blind man. Descent. That's the third pillar. And rather than a character growing stronger or growing more moral or finding out more about who you really are, you're torn down. This can be physically, like wounds or broken legs when the monster is coming after you and attacking you. Or it can be moral descent, as in you're breaking down from the good person that you could be. Or it could be descent in other ways, as in the person you thought you were is now getting torn apart by the encounter with the struggles that this other brings into your life. And by the way, tell me if I'm talking with my hands too much. I tend to do that, and I don't know if that freaks you out on the big screen or not. But it just now occurred to me that might be weird for you. Okay, not at all. We're cool with that. So I'll keep talking with my hands. And where was I? The fourth pillar. I like to call doom, because that that essentially Old English word means so many things. It's like now doom means like something bad is going to happen to you, and I kind of mean that as well. But it's also like you're stuck with it no matter what. There was no way to avoid it, or it's your fault. And the original doom kind of meant both things. It was like this judgment leveled upon somebody that was your fate. It wasn't always a bad thing, but it was normally a bad thing because normally you did something wrong and it was leveled against you, or it was inevitable. So what we have in doom, essentially, to break it apart into two, is we have implication and inevitability. And it can be either or in a horror structure story, I think, in which the main character is at fault for not only the seclusion, but well, a really good horror structure, the main character is at fault for the seclusion, for the other breaking through the threshold, and for the descent. Somehow the main character is at fault for all that. Or it was inevitable. This was always going to be, and it always shall, and it shall continue so long as human nature is this thing. You know, you were always the caretaker, or that moment at the end of Bartleby the Scrivener when he realizes this isn't just about Bartleby and my weird little Wall Street business. This is all humanity. Oh God, what are we become? And so with those four pillars, I think you can structure a story. As a writer, I think you can build a story around these four things, whichever one is most appealing to you. Like maybe you have this idea for an other kind of creature, but you don't know what to do with it. Maybe you want to tell a story set and I don't know, maybe you have the setting in mind. So you have the seclusion. Sammy works in this little store, right? And then in walk two girls in nothing but bathing suits. Like, oh no, the other thing is already shaken up my world, and now I must deal with it, and it goes badly. Or maybe you have various events like Story of an Hour in mind. And so you can, or how they're going to descend. So I think you can start with one, and what do you do with a story? How do you build a story around it, where you fill out and connect those other four pillars? And essentially, I think you have a horror structure story there. I'm just now checking my time. I want to make sure I have time to read a story to you. I think I better get onto it because I think this one takes 15 minutes to read, and then I want to make sure we have plenty of time. Oh, I have till 1:30. Okay, we're good there. Yeah, let me. So I threw that horror structure thing at you. So maybe let those ideas bounce around in your head. If there's something about them that you think, whoa, Josh, that's way off, or that doesn't work, or would this work, or what about this story or movie or game? Would that work? Let those bounce around in your mind. Share them in the comments, and then maybe we can start building up kind of some talking ideas for a Q&A. And while you have that bouncing around in the back of your mind, maybe I'll share a story of mine. It would be awesome to read from The Black Palace, a novel that I really enjoyed writing, and I always cringe inside when I call it a novel because technically Northrop Frye, Tolkien, they would all say it's not a novel, it's a romance. So, okay, but I don't think anybody else would get that if I put, The Black Palace, a gothic action adventure romance with witches. And then they're waiting for a love story, and there's not really, well, there's kind of one, but not really. Anyway, but I think that doesn't work well in a single reading. I think short stories, actually poets have it best. Poems work really well in readings, but short stories are better than sections of a novel. So I think I'm going to read one from O Monstrous World. And this one is fun because almost every story in this book, by the way, I was told was unpublishable, either in a workshop, somebody told me that's unpublishable, and then they were all published, and then they were all published again, and then I got awards. So let that be a lesson to you when people tell you your stuff is weird and unpublishable in workshop. Know that, well, Josh kept publishing his even though they didn't. But I really didn't write this for anybody else other than my friends who were in this story. And a bizarrely large number of things in this story are true. But I just called it fiction and mixed and matched and added weird stuff. One reason I wanted to read it is because it's fun. Another reason is because it was kind of the beginning of what ended up being my jam. I don't know, the monsters. I didn't realize I had a monster issue even after publishing a lot of these works. But when I wrote this story, by the end of it, I realized, man, I want to teach a monsters and literature class. And so I got an invitation from local libraries to start doing these seminars. Then I thought, I'll just record them and put them out as a podcast and see what happens. Then 2-3 years later, here we are, and it's still running. And another thing, I just went through that whole spiel about how horror structure works, and I don't think this is one of my horror structure stories, actually. It's more of a comic quest than a horror structure story. So I might have just done something stupid there, but here we go. So I want to tell you a story in which, now these are real friends of mine. There's a writer you might already be familiar with, a military writer named Pinckney Benedict. And then there's another fellow named Kermit Moore, who you might not be familiar with unless you've been arrested in Virginia. And so I want to tell you a story in which Pinckney Benedict, Kermit Moore, and I go hunting for the big muddy monster. And the title of the story is In Which Pinckney Benedict, Kermit Moore, and I Go A-Hunting for the Big Muddy Monster. We were going to hunt Grendel. The report said that since the late 60s, witnesses have been calling it the big muddy monster around here. But we had it otherwise on good authority. Joyce Carol Oates had told Pinckney that John Gardner had told her that he had seen it. First, he had heard it howl deep in the woods somewhere one night, and then one afternoon, as he roamed the backwoods, he had been forced to rip his wheels to a stop, his bike nearly kicking out from under him. It had crossed the gravel right before his eyes, and it had passed into the shade through some honeysuckle brush, slouching, and the birds hadn't even scattered as it went, but it had been angry regardless. Gardner had just known it. And it stunk. This was while he was teaching down here at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale, and he had told her that seeing it had inspired him to write Grendel, and that sometime during the writing of it, he had begun to believe that it had been the real Grendel, somehow a calling, a message from the sons of Cain. Never mind that Joyce Carol Oates had said that John Gardner was drunk while he had told her this, and drunk when he had seen it. No details would interfere with our hunt. I was packing my late father's Western-style lever action, a .308 Savage, in his honor. He had gone monster hunting himself back in Kentucky before I was born, but had found that the lunatic baying the farmers complained of were only highway guardrails popping and echoing as they cooled from the sun in the evening. Though the chickens that had been found folded inside out were never explained or accounted for. Pinckney was packing a tricked out AR-15 with zombie green stippling on the grip, and on the magazines, 12 banana clips arrayed like a Zodiac on his belt with tactical vest, free-floating handguard, iMod stock, cheek welds, waterproof storage compartment, holding his earbuds and an iPod shuffled with Pink Floyd, South African hip-hop, and his daughter's opera. I don't know about music, but she's good. Nickel-coated bolt carrier, aftermarket candy cane trigger, anti-rotational pin, also zombie green, upgraded barrel, obviously, 20 decibel suppressor, and about every type of optic and backup optic that there's a light or rail or swivel for. He named it the Humanity Department. Kermit was a deputy in Roanoke, Virginia, and had driven up just for this hunt, and a tiny little bright orange fuel-saving two-door, but he was about as big as the car. He also taught self-defense for charity, 2 canned goods per lesson. But I figured the best lesson was simply to be his size. In the hatchback, he had a duffel bag full of Glocks, I never found out how many, and a 12-gauge drum-fed street sweeper that he had confiscated and would use as a demonstration piece when he taught classes to other law enforcement folk, just to show them what the bad guys might be hiding in their coolers when you think they're going for a beer. One time he got pulled over with it, just sitting there in the back seat. He showed it off to the state trooper and they got to talking, and they spent the rest of the day a few miles up at the trooper's uncle's farm, blasting surplus garden veggies and talking about the filming difficulties of the creature from the Black Lagoon. But for our hunt, he was packing nothing more than a BFR 50 caliber Beowulf for poetic reasons. And by the way, we have space breaks here, what John Gardner would call crots, and you can't really hear them. And so, how about I'll just take a sip of coffee, and then when Josh is drinking a sip of coffee, you go, "That's a space break." Right before dusk, we parked out of the way at the mouth of an old logging road, and we spent a few minutes cutting thick-leaved branches and covered the car with a foil from sight. It did not matter whose sight we were hiding it from. In such endeavors to get identified was to fail. We walked through the tree line and kept quiet for a space. The logging road was a long lawn of grass and dandelions, and it took us past a couple of small fields heavy with soy and fenced by trees. The haze of the low light colored the soybean leaves navy, and they steamed. When the woods got thicker beside us, we left off the logging road and hiked in. We wouldn't need trails. Grindle wouldn't use trails. The canopy turned to night immediately, but we still spooked away plenty of birds and squirrels hard at work, all well awake. The air was fatty with the noise of crickets. We stopped every so often, Kermit and Pinckney scanning the area and listening. I would begin to do the same, but would get distracted with trying to identify what possible poison ivy. We were all sweating and wiping at mosquitoes. It was never reported to be seen in exactly the same place twice, Kermit said. It was the first any of us mentioned of the fact that we hunted in an entirely arbitrary location. Any spot was as likely as any other. I tried to sound grim, overdramatic, saying, "It could be watching us right now." Like Predator, Pinckney said, a little too loud. That's what Predator 2 should have been. It should have been set at Helrot, their first hunt on planet Earth. Beowulf tears off his arm so he can't go self-nuclear. And then when he tracks him down to his cave ship, Grendel's mother is a female predator. She makes the male ones look like little twerps. That's what Predator 2 should have been. We all agreed, and we kept moving. Soon we were using flashlights and stopping more frequently at sounds that skipped through the brush. We climbed across a creek and got nice and muddy, something that I noted would legitimize our trek. And we were working our way up an ascent when we spooked it. It was Grendel for sure, but Kermit caught them in his light, fleeing in slow leaps, whitetails flagging us, so we kept on. And that's when we found the shack. We swept the perimeter like we had practiced in person once, a dozen times online in-game. No one had cared about this shack for years, clearly, but our tactical movement was no less sharp for that fact. Pinckney hacked the kudzu out of the way so we could open the door, and we went inside. Someone had lived there once. The skeleton of bed spring sat near a wood-burning stove on its side, though we saw no flue. Coffee tins and swollen car manuals lay scattered on a desk and on some chairs taken from a hospital. All of the more recent cans of beer and party cups were empty on the floor. An old toaster's guts hung out across some screwdrivers and sockets, and in the corner I pulled back a sheet to uncover a piano. Pinckney and Kermit high-stepped it over the debris to see it with me, and they both said that it was actually a spinet. I said, "Oh yeah," as if I just remembered that. I tried a couple of keys. They were dead. Pinckney tried some too. "Just because we can't hear it," Kermit warned. "Be careful who you call for a dance." Then Pinckney found a key that worked. The twang it made was lonesome, quite unlike what it was surely meant to be. Listen to that, he said. He kept hitting it. He was hearing some beautiful quality in its sound and the way it echoed off the corrugated roof, something I wasn't getting. He produced his cell phone, though none of us had signals out here, and he began recording while I beat on the key for him. He was going to use it later for some of his Foley projects. Quiet, Kermit said. I stopped. The stream kept humming long after I had let up on the key, but then I realized that some of the sound came from farther off. Kermit saw something out of the window. They're singing, he said. They're crying. We followed him in a rush outside. We moved from concealment to cover with the urgency of a raid. But I couldn't hear anything now that we were outside again, and Pinckney didn't seem to either. We just followed Kermit. At the crest of the ascent, we went prone to avoid the risk of skylining ourselves, and Pinckney scoped ahead with the humanity department. It was completely night now, even above the canopy, and we had switched off and gone dark, as black as the leaves. The lights beyond the trees made me certain that something was going on in the pasture down there. I could now hear the distant droll of voices. What is it? I said. I think I see it, Pinckney said. What? They have lanterns, canvas walls. He paused, delighting in something. It's a hall, he said. It's charismatics. Space break. We walked the pasture, which had none of their cars or vans or buses, only horses and buggies. So I guess that they had met up over at Bald Knob Cross and had come down here on the trails the hard way to wheel back in time just a little for their own theatrics. They peeled open the tent flaps and welcomed us into the revival without a word about our guns, though they all eyed them. I imagine that they thought something at us like, all they that take the sword shall perish with the sword. But then I thought back, he that hath no sword, let him sell his garment and buy one. But then they thought back, I will rid evil beasts out of the land, neither shall the sword go through your land. And I had no comeback for that one. Inside was an oven full of swaying bodies on the folding chairs, kerosene lanterns swaying with them from ropes above, everyone rejoicing in their sweat, which they would not wipe as if it were finally a rainstorm promised them. We were packed in, unable not to touch each other. I stood on my toes to lift my head above the stench of hot body odor that stayed on a roiling boil. The closer to the front, the more the charismatics were standing or kneeling, arms moving like snakes, heads lolling. Against the far tent wall, the preacher stood on a storage trunk, reading from a Bible with his eyes closed. And the Lord said unto him, he said with a light tune, like reciting Happy Birthday for an infant. Therefore, whoever slayeth Cain, vengeance shall be taken upon him sevenfold. And the Lord set a mark upon Cain, lest any finding him should kill him. Beside him, two old women in long skirts beat on the bodies and pick guards of their guitars, but they did not strum. And a third one swept at the grass on the ground beneath them with a broom. They danced. An army officer in uniform, a full-bird colonel, stood at the front too, tapping a tambourine. The people moaned. They laughed and they moaned. Then the preacher reached out over the heads of the congregation, moving them in an unseen wave like the heads of grain in a wind. And he strained as if trying to touch us all the way at the back where Pinckney and Kermit and I stood. The preacher said, have I need of mad men that ye have brought this fellow to play the madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come into my house? Yea, the people said, yea. And some of them spoke with words and bubbles and gargles that I did not understand. The preacher stepped off his trunk and he motioned others toward it. Two men came to him, knelt by the trunk, and began to unlatch it. A few in the congregation fell to the ground and called out. And as the men lifted the lid off the trunk, the preacher spoke in tongues himself, saying, as best I could tell, Fleka da nogalia Cthulhu rea wakalin flatigan. I already knew what was in the trunk. I already knew what was in the trunk before he reached in. They migrated through this area every year, and it would be easy enough to gather a trunkload of them as they crossed the roads. The preacher reached in and he lifted forth a rattler by its middle. He spoke the right verses about it, and it whipped around, easily capable of sinking fangs into his arm, but it didn't. The people moved faster now. They got louder and they moved faster. The place was a wave pool, too crowded, moving me with them. They babbled. They didn't sing, but I heard the music. I heard the music with them. Finally, I was moving to it with them. Kermit said my name as if to ask if I were okay, but I knew there were more rattlers in that trunk. They shook their tails to our music. I could lift one too. I'm going up there, I said. Don't, Josh, Kermit said. Don't do it. I'm going up there, I said again. And Pinckney said, he's going up there, as if it never occurred to him to try stopping me. Kermit held my arm, but I slithered right out of his grip. And the preacher waved me forward, and the people waved, and I washed up in front at the trunk, and the rattler smiled up at me. Space break. Just keep running, Kermit screamed, hauling me over his shoulders, the tent ablaze behind us, pillars of smoke and pillars of fire roaring with pressurized tank explosions and the wails of the charismatics. I cried and screamed in high-pitched delirium. My arm was swollen and already turning black from the crook of my elbow out, almost as if the bite had burned me to a blistering crisp. Pinckney ran ahead with the humanity department in one hand, stock and armpit ready to shoot anything in our path, and in the other hand, a thrashing sack that held the rattler that had gotten me. He was screaming, and Kermit was screaming, and I was screaming. Things had gone wrong back there. One after the other, many things had gone very wrong. We rushed through the lattice of limbs and leaves in the woods, and my arm hurt like it was being torn off as I was jostled by Kermit's carrying me while running. But I was in no condition to do my own running. I was lost to terror and prophecy, crying out that we would never make it through this night. The world itself would come to an end. The fires behind us caught hold of the tree line. The night sky soaked up its hot, bleeding orange. I suppose I was the only one of the three of us watching the scene behind. I saw silhouettes of men and beasts all ascatter. Large shapes galloped past us faster than we could ever run, but we kept running. Without stopping, Pinckney shot at something close to his feet and kept running and screaming. Kermit didn't slow either. I felt us rise over a hill and run down another valley deep and swamp-like, and that's when we stopped. They stopped screaming, so I did too. Only then could I hear the lunatic baying right in front of us. The thing rose from the liquid ground, its long head dripping, its thin arms melting and batting at the air as it screamed high and terrible. We stood in the lagoon, a mire, and it stunk like sewage and swine and death. The thing writhed in the middle of that mess before us, the black goo of its skin gleaming in our lights, the ribs of its barrel body shining like rippled shelves. Kermit and Pinckney said nothing, unsure of what to do for it, but it bucked and shook its drenched mane and bit at the mud with the flat of its teeth, and it kept screaming at us. Only I, in delirium, could see the truth of what it was. And in the wild whites of its eyes, in the blacks of them, it saw me too. And we both knew the sight for what it was. It was the big muddy monster. It was Grendel. It was Humbaba, Minotaur, Behemoth, Fenrir, Caucus of the eighth layer, Moloch the counselor, Nightmare, the creature of Frankenstein. Id, Gothmog, Yog Sothoth, Anung Unrama, and lo, the black horse, whose rider held balances in his hand, whose rider was lost from his mount. It sank in the tar, and I with it, the two of us plates on the scales, tipping in turns, ever lower under the waves of the mire, too slow to perceive. And we could no longer see one another, where we lay crushed in unison under the surface of the earth, as if embraced again by an inexplicable mother, where heat and gravity sang to us, where all things become one in the end, where we could no longer see where either of us began, finally knowing what monsters are for. That's it. That's the story. Well, so that and that was a story that just I wrote for my thank you very much, Brandy. So that was just the story. Really, I just wrote to entertain myself and Pinckney and Kermit and my wife, who likes to stay generally invisible in my group for good reason, perhaps. Um, and it didn't. And then I never really thought about it getting published, but I went ahead and sent it off to one of these big, I forget, contests or calling. And sure enough, it got snatched up right away, and people were publishers were fighting over it. So yeah, and I don't know. So is yet another one of these weird projects that I think shouldn't have gotten out there, but did. And I find that as proof that I'm giving students the right advice about writing those things you love, about digging into it and just throwing it out there. But don't write it for them, and don't write it for approval. Write it for your real people, your real friends, or yourself, or your real reasons. And then just throw it out there and see what happens. And maybe nothing, maybe something. So maybe we could throw some ideas or questions my way, and then we could either do Q&A stuff, or if you have requests for me to elaborate a little bit more on those ideas I shared or the story, I'm fine with going anywhere. So how about we give everybody a second to consider any questions or comments you want to throw them up in the comments, or if you're allowed to shout out loud if you're in the auditorium, and we can start a kind of question and answer era of the session.
Yeah, Josh, I think what we'll do is we'll see if we can do any questions from the live audience here first, and then while we're doing that, Brandy, if you wouldn't mind taking a look through the Q&A and the chat at the bottom for us, and we'll see if there's anything coming from that side. So we'll hit the live side first. So do we have any questions here from the live audience first here? Anybody? Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, over here. Somebody go ahead.
So I heard of there's only 10 stories in the universe, and this is new for me that to break it down into only 2 stories. And I mean, one of them, you may have touched on this already in sort of talking about the different genres and how they apply to your work, but one of those 10 stories I remember was person meets person. It's the finding relations, finding community. Where do you see that story fitting into this breakdown of the 2 of the horror structure of the quest?
That's a really good question, and you don't have to go very far. Oh, by the way, the question in general, if anybody was having trouble hearing that, the idea that there are only 2 stories seems weird, especially if you've heard there are 10 stories. And what about the person meets person story? That's a really good question. In fact, wherever you go, and if you start looking up the how many stories are there, then you're going to get, or how many story structures are, you'll never get 2 answers that are the same. There are 3 stories, there are 5 stories, there are only 37 types of plots. And actually there's some good lists, I think 37 plots that exist. Uh, really, so you get to decide really how many stories there are, but about that, I think the one that's really worth taking apart is that person meets person story. And so for me, I see it as I tend to call it the love story, but I also include friendship stories as the love story. And it doesn't have to be exactly love or friendship. But then again, you can't, it's really hard to get away with two characters encountering each other in a story. That often happens if you have multiple characters in the story. So that almost always happens in a story. But if it's the focus of a story, for me, I call it the love story or the love slash buddy story, the friendship story. And in fact, they structurally they work the same. And so a love story like, or what we might consider now the genre of a romance story, everything from Pride and Prejudice to every single romantic comedy ever made that are all based on Pride and Prejudice, all the way to say friendship stories, whether that's um, oh, I don't know, almost every buddy cop movie. I don't know, Shrek and Donkey, like a million stories in which it's kind of even Shaun of the Dead it says it's a romantic zombie comedy, but really, I mean, kind of, but really it's about the two friends kind of like working through their friendship and coming together as friends in the end. But it works the same whether it's friendship or love. And that goes through what seems like to me in a whole lot of ways kind of you love how I threw monsters and I got to sneak monsters into the love story. To me, that the love story kind of works in a lot of ways like a quest. It's a figurative quest, very much figurative. Um, so you don't start off with this character who like meets a wise mentor, gains a sword or magic shoes, and then goes out on a quest for another world. But it is a quest for love. It's a quest in which you start off with a character who doesn't have themselves sorted out or their place in the world sorted out, but there is a destiny. Wait, on the screen, I want to go up in the upper right. So there is a destiny that you can climb the top of the mountain. And at the heart, the ethos of the love story is that true love is true, that your best self is when you finally come together with your true love in which you're both your true selves. And that means they have to go through times when they pick the wrong person for the wrong reasons, when they try to be something other than themselves. They have to go through, rather than fighting angry trees throwing apples at them or flying monkeys or evil monsters in the forest or something like that in a more literal quest story. They have to fight through bad advice from their friends. They have to fight through um, uh, uh, conflicts with each other, miscommunication. That's why when you turn it into a comedy, and Shakespeare's comedies, I think are the pinnacle of how to do that kind of thing. It's almost always misinformation, hidden identities, playing one lie on another and getting tangled up in the lies. And then you sort them all out and then you end in a marriage. That's right. Or you end in every Shakespeare comedy ends in the marriage, but now you can end in some other vision of communal, communal joy and happiness. Or it can be like The Hangover, which is a Shakespearean comedy, and end at somebody else's wedding that you kind of broke apart and put back together by the very end. But that works in a lot of ways as a quest story, or it hits those kinds of beats. In the horror structure story, you very often have person meets person, but it's not really always good. I think you could perhaps say, what did I was using Raymond Carver's Cathedral, and that could be seen as kind of a buddy story, almost like a relationship story. But it was a real painful thing for that protagonist. Everything that he was got torn apart, and he got led by the hand like a psychopomp into this other world through this otherworldly numinous cathedral, and he never returns. And that's the death of of who that character was. But yeah, you have, I guess, other kinds of other stories. Anyway, that's a really good question. That's how I see kind of love stories or person meets person stories fitting in those two types. Well, by the way, let me end on, you can choose however many types of stories you want. I think Aristotle said, yeah, Aristotle wanted three, the epic, the tragedy, and the comedy, and the tragedy being the greatest. Freytag wanted two, the play and the anti-play. Uh, um, Vladimir Prop wanted one, but very detailed, right? Campbell wanted one. I want two. You can have 37, however many you.
Thank you for that, Josh. Brandy, I see some numbers going up. Can you help us with any questions that came from the Zoom?
Sure. So thank you. I laughed so hard during that reading, and I know you could, I turned my face off, but it was so good. We do have a couple of questions here, and I have some questions if there's time too. But we have someone asking, okay, so in the Q&A, some of the examples you provided of the quests and the horror remind me of the stories of video games. So my question is, do book writers often get hired to work on stories of video games, movies as well?
Good question. And more, yeah, we're seeing a lot of crossover with different storytelling platforms. And the more that's possible in the world of video games, the more we're seeing that kind of crossover. I mean, even years and years ago, man, was it you remember a game LA Noir? I think it was LA Noir. I mean, it was years and years and years ago. And they hired Joyce Carol Oates to come in and do some writing for them. Right. And so the literary writers have been crossing over into that world for quite some time. And I mean, I admit that I'm playing in the world of film and script consultation and getting some stuff. Well, things don't, it's hard to get things produced, but you can play around in that world and work with producers, right? And then in video games as well. And yeah, I think um, there's you see a lot of games that kind of break off into horror games or into quest adventure games and those two kinds of ways. But the richer the video games are getting, the more immersive they're getting, the more that they're pulling from all sorts of great storytelling techniques. And you have some extreme advantages in the video game, which is you you get the immersiveness that it takes a good reader a lot of focus to get. The video game almost forces the immersiveness on you, especially VR. And VR has helped get through quarantine life for me at least. I mean, all you have to do is put it on and you're there, and I'm screaming at my Star Trek crew at one side of the house, and my wife's like, what's going on? Oh, the Borg are attacking and his crew's not doing very well. But I'm not in my house. I am in the future, and I'm fighting the Borg. Like, the video games will put you in it and you don't even have to try. And that's a great advantage to video games. One aspect of video games that I would really like to see broken open and explored a little bit more is to make it less a broadcast story. And we figured out the best story, now you just play through our story, and more open world. Because the great advantage of a video game is it can create a whole setting, a whole world for you to explore and for you to create an entirely unique story. And so I tend toward those more open world games in which you get to make your own stuff, to the point of sometimes I will get only the sandbox physics engine of a game rather than the game itself, just so I can do my own thing in there. And so I'd like to see that happening more with video games. But if not, I'm pretty sure it's surpassed the film industry as far as numbers and hours and dollars in, and we're going to continue to see that. If film was the breakout storytelling medium of the 20th century, I'll go ahead and be on record and say video games are the breakout medium of storytelling in the 21st.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. Wow, very fascinating. But I have another question. in the Q&A from one of our own creative writing professors, Lenny Owens. And he wants to know, he says, hey Josh, have you read Benjamin Percy's craft book, Thrill Me? He's a genre transient author who has published both literary and genre fiction. And in Thrill Me, he tries to connect the stylistic tissues between the too often segregated literary and popular genres of fiction. So I'm thinking,
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, great shout out to Ben Percy. He's awesome. He was another SAUC fellow. I think he graduated the year before I got there, a couple of years before I got there as well, and worked with him a little bit in the Surreal South series years back. And man, he's one hell of a storyteller, and he's really good at breaking that apart. But about that book, I haven't read that book specifically. I have read some separately, some of the essays in that book that went into making that up. But yeah, it's on my list. I haven't even read his werewolf novel yet. That's how far behind I am on my Percy reading. So I need to read that novel. I need to get him on the podcast and stuff. You're reminding me. I'm going to write it down, by the way. Get Ben on the podcast. We need to talk werewolves and other things. He does a great job of kind of, at one point I remember years back with Surreal South, he was saying something like, I don't know if I'm not into the weird stuff. I'm more of a literary writer. And then not very long later, he's writing werewolf books. He's writing Batman comic books, right? So he's all in, and I think he bridges the gap brilliantly. I think he's a great writer to watch if you want to see how that kind of thing is done as well. And he articulates that well. I think one of his most brilliant essays about craft is the one, I think it's called Get a Job. And it's about seeing, when you're writing a story, see the point of view through your character's job and how that character sees the world because of the job. And that's a whole MFA education in one essay. I think it's quite brilliant.
Yeah, I need to read that too. So thanks. So we have another question about video games. What are your thoughts on video games with branching story paths or different endings? Do you think they're harder to write?
Yes, they are so hard to write. Oh my God, it's so much work. After doing that once, I said never again. Because you just try it sometime. Try to, okay, this is the beginning, and then the character can either do this or this. I keep track of it. But then it's like this or this or this. And before you even get going anywhere, you already had to write like 5 different stories, and you're not even close to end yet. And so our project was going through kind of a traditional RPG thing. This was to age me a little bit. This was using Neverwinter Nights kind of modding engine or customization engine. And so we had a crew pulling that together for the military, believe it or not, because the military were tapping some of us to help explore what's possible through training and education through video games. And branching storylines, man, they're very hard to write. But if you're really fascinated with the possible worlds and you want to, or perhaps you're one of those writers who figured out a smoother way to bottleneck the story over and over again, or customize one aspect of it. Like, so maybe some of the major events that you have to do the writing and the programming and the art for are all the same, but it's your character who gets to change throughout that. Then maybe you can streamline a little bit of so you're only changing the dialogue, not the big parts that take so much production. I'm not really on the production end of it enough to say with authority how much harder it is to produce, but and the writing. Give it a shot. I think you'll want to stop after your first try, and kudos to the people who do it.
Brand, do we have time for maybe one more question? Do we have one more?
Yes. Okay, one more question. Professor Vaughn asks, why do you think Lovecraft is not considered canonical?
Oh, why is Lovecraft not considered canonical? Oh, uh, it is to me. He is to me. He's canonical to me. Um, but I don't think anybody would want to go on a record and agree with me. But for me, the 20th, the two, if we had to say that, I don't know why I'm substitute two today. I'm just going to go with two. The two great writers of the 20th century were Tolkien and Lovecraft. And we have proof. The two writers that people are obsessed with to this day are Tolkien and Lovecraft. If we had to narrow down to like, oh yeah, well, what about James Joyce? Well, nobody loves Joyce. You can appreciate him, but I have never once met somebody who loves James Joyce. You don't even like him. You just appreciate him. No, it's Tolkien and it's Lovecraft. And they're extreme opposites. They were the extreme opposite type of person in every way. They would have hated each other so much that they would not be able to stay in the room together. They saw everything about the world in opposite ways. They had extremely opposite stories. That you love Joyce, okay, well, you're like, okay, now the dead did get me. Now that story did. I tear up at the end of that story every time. Um, but once you get into Finnegan's Wake, I don't know, I just can't take it. But I think Lovecraft should and is canonical, and I would argue that he already is unofficially, like he's the punk rock. Look at how many video games are based on Lovecraft. Look at how much horror is Lovecraftian horror, or look at how much horror is that horror that's based on people who uh the Dubliners are okay. We got a bunch of Joyce fans. I'll back off. I'm afraid you're gonna have a James Joyce gang and beat me up Irish style. Okay, you all love Joyce, but you can keep Joyce, and I'll take Lovecraft and Tolkien. And I think we're already seeing that Lovecraft is real in a lot of people's lives. I had to go inspect like Yates. I had to go like inspect a high school's classes. I am not the kind of guy who needs to be doing that, but like our college oversees what we call dual credit classes. So I had to go in the high school to like police the teacher. Nobody really knew what I was doing. And it was some Catholic high school. And then there was some like 16-year-old girl like hiding this book on her way through the principal's office. And I look, and it's Lovecraft. It's all of Lovecraft's work. I'm like, you're into Lovecraft? She's like, I don't know, but my friends are all into it and they say it's cool and I'm not supposed to be seen with it. Like they're like sneaking Lovecraft around to each other. It's alive for readers. I think canonically though, for the Western canon, you could never get somebody like Bloom to get it. You couldn't even get Bloom to actually read read Tolkien, Harold Bloom. I love the guy, but he lied about Tolkien. You're not going to get professors and experts other than maybe St. Joshi, taking Lovecraft too seriously. I think everybody's afraid of racism. Oh, well, I think it's kind of showed up there too. I think it's a false focus in Lovecraft, but I think it's not worth somebody's publishing career. I think nobody wants to touch it. I think a lot of people who like that dark stuff like it secretively and they don't want to talk good about it yet. I think the time will come, and I think we're seeing different things kind of open a door for that. So, and I think Lovecraft Country, for instance, is one way that's kind of opening the door to making it okay to like Lovecraft. Cormac McCarthy made it okay for people to admit they like post-apocalyptic stuff. And I think we're entering the age when it's going to be okay to admit that you like Lovecraft, because he was a genius and he changed the world of storytelling, and it will never go back to the way it was before Lovecraft. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Josh, for joining us. We do appreciate it today. We were really so excited to have you, and we learned so much from you. So thank you so much. And I'll just finish by saying, you'll have to read O Monstrous World and read. There's a story in there about a bench that will just mess with your head. So that one about the bench, Josh, just floored me.
Oh,
Yeah.
Yeah, the alchemist bench, that I think that one is a horror structure story.
That is just right out of the Twilight Zone. Anyway, thank you all so much for coming in Zoom and coming live in person. We do greatly appreciate it, and hope those of you live and some of you on Zoom will join us for some of the other Expo events later today and tomorrow. Thank you so much, everyone. Bye-bye.
It was a great honor. Thank you very much. Great questions as well. Appreciate it.